All right, I'm really excited to chat with Carlos Collazo, who covers the MLB Draft for Baseball America. You'll see him on MLB Network. I know at least last year with the draft coverage. I imagine this year as well. Also, co-host of the Future Projection podcast, which is one of my favorite baseball podcasts out there. Actually listened to it the other day on my way to Goodyear for the Rangers spring training game, and there's a lot of really fun conversation about the guys at the top of the draft, and that's what I want to talk to Carlos about, with the Rangers having the second pick in this year's draft. Carlos, thanks so much for hanging out here for a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the kind words about the podcast. It's been a fun little project to get started over the last few weeks, and I feel like now we're kind of hitting a groove with it. So,
well, I love it, and I love the. I mean, I was texting you about this. Uh, sign, trade, or cuts.
yeah.
And you did that with, I guess. You guys mentioned how there could be a four-person kind of top tier for this draft, but really definitively right now, it seems like there are three: Kumar Rocker, Jack Leiter, and then DFW's own Jordan Lawler. And you guys went through that exercise, and I'm not going to replay that because I want people to listen to your thoughts and your co-host Ben Badler's thoughts on that. But I do want to talk about these three guys because it seems like, and things can change, and as you guys have talked about it, as so many people have talked about with this draft, maybe there's more volatility because last year really wasn't a thing. And there's still so much to be learned about some of these guys, especially, I imagine the high school guys. But it seems like the Rangers picking it to will likely end up with one of Kumar Rocker, Jack Leiter, or Jordan Lawler. So I guess quickly, what if we can go through all three?
Yeah.
What's an easy synopsis or brief scouting report? Let's start with Kumar Rocker, the name who I think is maybe most well known.
Yeah, I think that's a really great summary, by the way, just of kind of how the draft stands at this point in time. Kumar is the number one player on our board still. We just updated our draft board yesterday, actually expanded to the top 300 prospects, but he was the preseason number one just kind of because he was the only guy of this college class that had proven it over an extensive amount of time at a high level in the SEC. He is still there. I don't think the number one placement should mean that he is a consensus top player in the class. I think at this point in time, like you mentioned, it's really kind of a race among three names there. And depending on the org or the scout that you talk to, I think any of those names would be mentioned in that number one spot. But Kumar just has some of the best pure stuff in the class. He's a very physical pitcher, 6'4", around 250 pounds, a really loud fastball that he can run up to 99 miles per hour. And I think arguably one of the better breaking balls in the entire class, and his slider that in college has just been an absolutely overwhelming pitch. He gets whiffs on that pitch in the zone, out of the zone. It's a really impressive two-pitch combo. I think the questions with him are going to be refining a third pitch. And I think it's a little tough in college because there's really no incentive for him to go into a deeper repertoire. His two-pitch combo has been more than enough to get hitters out. He's added a cutter this year, so that's another interesting little wrinkle to his pitch mix. But again, Kumar is a guy who's been a highly touted prospect going back to his high school days when he was a first-round talent coming out of high school. And his teammate Jack Leiter is similar in that regard. He was also thought of as a first-round talent out of high school. He had a heavy commit to Vanderbilt and a pretty high price tag, so he got to campus, and it looks like that's already paid off very well for him. Just him and Kumar going back-to-back on weekends for Vanderbilt's pitching staff is a tremendous treat just to watch. I'm sure opposing teams do not feel the same way, but Leiter is more, I don't want to say he doesn't have power stuff because he certainly does. He's run his fastball up to the 98, 99 mile per hour range as well. But he seems a little bit more polished in terms of his fastball command specifically. And then he's been more willing to use a deeper pitch mix at this stage. He throws both a slider and a really good 12-6 curveball. He's shown a changeup in the past. I think both of these guys, both Leiter and Rocker, have shown good changeups in the past. I think it's tough in the college game for players that have such good fastball breaking ball combos to really rely on that too heavily when you don't really need to. So I think both of those guys can develop that third or fourth pitch changeup. And then Lawler is entirely different. Obviously, he's not a college player. He's not a pitcher. But in some ways, I think it's almost a safer overall profile. Just when you talk about the hit rates and the injury rates of pitchers generally, not specifically any concerns about Rocker or Leiter in that regard, but just the general hit rate on pitching prospects versus hitting prospects. But Lawler really has a well-rounded profile of above average or better tools. I don't think he is quite as explosive in the tool sense that Bobby Witt Jr. was, who many Texas residents are probably very familiar with, and baseball fans as a whole are becoming even more familiar with. But I think he's a guy who you can look at and see a player who's going to hit for a high average, hit for some power, play defense at a high level defensively, run the bases well, really do everything well across the board. And it's just a matter of how physically impressive he becomes the next few years as he fills out that frame. How much power does he get to, and how he's able to refine his defensive game. But I really like everything about the profile and don't see any real holes in his game to speak of. So those are kind of the top three guys, how I see them at this point.
It's crazy because he's a Vanderbilt commit. So Vanderbilt essentially is taking possibly the first 3 picks in the draft.
Exactly.
It's an embarrassment of riches. Okay, I want to quickly ask you about Kumar Rocker and Jack Leiter kind of toe to toe. First of all, I was at USC when UCLA had Garrett Cole and Trevor Bauer, and those two were incredibly impressive. Mm-hmm. They went at the top of the draft, Garrett Cole and Bauer in the top 3. Those guys didn't like each other one bit. They still don't. They didn't then. It was very evident then. What do you know what the relationship is like between Kumar Rocker and Jack Leiter? Not that it should matter necessarily from a draft standpoint, but just out of curiosity.
I don't personally know, but I've seen interviews from both of them, and it seems like they really have a good relationship with each other. They both seem like pretty cerebral pitchers in terms of how they go about working on their craft. They're obviously very competitive, so I think they kind of thrive off of pitching back to back with one another. Both pitchers probably want to one up everyone each week, but at the same time, I think Leiter even said that they're both kind of rooting for each other to throw no hitters every weekend out. Jack Leiter already has his no-hitter this season. Kumar obviously had his last year against Duke, so we might be able to see more of those in the future. But it seems from the outside looking in that it's a pretty solid relationship. Definitely none of the quirkiness of the Bauer-Cole relationship from back in the day. I think that may have been a case of just two very different styles and pitchers thinking about the game. It seems like Leiter and Rocker are a little bit more on the same page again from the outside looking in.
So Garrett Cole and Trevor Bauer, when they were at school, were at different stages in their development, and you even mentioned, I mean, they kind of go about things differently. And I know for us, when I was at USC, Trevor Bauer almost threw like a 15 strikeout perfect game against us. We had if I remember, there's a guy by the name of Adam Landecker had like an infield single or maybe a C&I single in the 7th, and that was it. We didn't have the same type of problems against Garrett Cole, but no one, or I shouldn't say no one. I mean, Trevor Bauer was drafted 3rd, Garrett Cole 1st, so it wasn't that far off. But it seemed like most people that you would speak to would say, no, Garrett Cole is the better prospect. So I guess there are going to be Rangers fans who are going to look at the college stats, and they're going to look and see, this guy ended up being better than that guy, whether Rocker or Leiter have the better stats. But could you, from your experience, maybe share how that's not necessarily the best way to look at what the present and the future might entail for these two?
Yeah, definitely. I think that when you're talking about amateur players generally, whether that's high school or college players, it is very difficult to simply just scout the stat line and kind of make your decisions based on the performance results. Those obviously matter, and I think they do matter to a greater degree when you're pitching in the SEC. And in some ways, I feel like guys, when they're playing on the same team and they're pitching against basically the same lineup every weekend, it can be instructive. But at the same time, like you mentioned, these are two players who are still developing. They're working on things. They're still growing as pitchers and as players physically. So it certainly isn't the end all be all. Scouts are looking at stuff. They're looking to see how a pitcher is accomplishing the things that they're trying to do on the mound. They're trying to see how they repeat a delivery. They're trying to see how they turn a lineup over the second and third time, how they hold their stuff. So there are a lot of things that you can't see just by looking at the stat sheet. And I think plenty of teams certainly put a large degree of importance in performing in this sort of conference. But yeah, you have to go a little bit beyond the stat line. Things like secondary pitches. How are they showing feel for those pitches? Are they developing them over the year? Are they losing feel for those pitches? Are they relying on one pitch now that maybe could be seen as an issue, but you feel like when you get them into a pro development system, they're going to focus on these secondary pitches like we talked about with the changeup? I don't think either of these pitchers are in an environment where there's much incentive to throw that with high frequency. that can change at the next level. So scouts are looking to see just the feel that these guys show for those pitches in between innings, stuff that's not even on a stat sheet or you won't even see in highlights or in game. So I think all of those little things are part of the package when you're trying to see an overall profile for the player. The performance does matter, obviously. If you're not performing over an entire year, if you're getting hit around, that's going to affect your draft stock. But when we're talking about the specifics or the details, I think you have to go a little bit beyond that.
With the Vandy guys, and Kumar Rocker and Jack Leiter are independent of Sonny Gray and Mike Minor and Walker Buehler and all the other Vandy pitchers who have come through and had success. But how much stock is put into a program's ability to develop pitchers and the track record that Vandy has had? I know that, if I'm not mistaken, pitching coach has changed over the course of that time. But is there any additional stock that's put into the fact, well, this program has developed pitchers who've had success in the majors versus someone coming from a program that maybe doesn't have that track record? Or is that not something that's really considered at all?
I think it's considered, just to add that context, like you're talking about, like scouts are definitely very aware of the programs and how successful they are in developing these pitchers and the methodologies they use to train their players. So I think knowing that a player is at a program, whether that's Vanderbilt, whether that's another program that has a really high success rate and does a really good job developing them, just knowing that in your scouting report is helpful. It doesn't mean that a player who is at a lower level program or maybe a program that you don't think develops pitchers well is going to be hurt in the draft. And in some cases, I think that's an opportunity for those players where scouts or teams maybe will give you the benefit of the doubt, saying, okay, he's doing this now in the environment that he's currently in. What is he going to look like when we get him in our pro development where we think we're doing everything at a very high level? So I think just kind of using their environment and understanding the context that they're working in is helpful. But I don't necessarily think that because a Jack Leiter or a Kumar Rocker is at Vanderbilt specifically, they're thought of as kind of top of the class guys. I think that's more so just their talent is very impressive, just generally.
All right, Carlos, I think I did this exercise last year when the Rangers were sort of, I hate to say fighting for the number one overall pick because they certainly weren't trying for it on the field, but it was certainly up for grabs. And I went and looked at the average WAR for the first pick, second pick, third pick, what have you. And the first pick is certainly above the rest, and second pick above, everything other than first and whatnot. But if you look at a given draft, it doesn't always work out that way. For instance, I randomly, before we started, just pulled up the 2018 draft, which maybe isn't fair because, these guys certainly haven't completed their stories by any means, but Joey Bart was taken second. I don't know that he's going to be the second best player, even among the top 10 picks. And Jared Kelenic was sixth, and certainly looks like, if there was a redraft, maybe he'd be higher. And it happens this way in every sport. So I guess
the Kyler Murray pick might have not happened, huh?
What's that?
Said the Kyler Murray pick might have not happened that year.
Yeah, exactly. So if you were to, obviously all three of these guys are viewed very favorably, and they all have tremendous potential. If there's one guy who you looked at and thought, man, 5-6 years from now, we might be wondering where this guy is or what happened to this guy, of those three, which guy would that be and why?
In terms of which guy I think has a chance to be just really good, or which guy?
No, kind of. I hate
the opposite.
Yeah, the opposite.
Yeah, it's tough because at this point, I mean, if I felt strongly about any of those guys that way, either I would have gotten feedback from the industry that wouldn't have them in this spot. So I think it's very hard to ask that question now, but it is a good question to ask. And I think I'll probably just default to one of the pitchers. And again, it has nothing to do with Jack Leiter or Kumar Rocker specifically. But just looking back, I mean, the last pitcher that went 1-1 was Casey Mize a few years ago. And because of injuries, his progression and his development has got a little bit derailed. You're talking about that 2018 draft class. If teams were able to redo that, I'm not sure that Casey Mize would be the number one pick in that draft. Obviously, we're doing this with hindsight, and it's impossible to do that moving forward. But I think just in general, we've seen, and I think we've even seen a shift in our top 100 prospects list. There are fewer pitchers now in the top 10 of that list because of the hit rate that pitchers just show generally. So I won't pick one specific player, whether that's lighter or rocker, but I think, and this is why if you listen to our podcast when we did the sign one, trade one, cut one, I went with Jordan Lawler just because I think when you're splitting hairs with guys, that becomes a much more, I guess it's just easier to default to the hitter because of the hit rate for pitching prospects because of the injuries that they can go through that can really change up their development.
All right,
I guess that's
more.
my cop out answer.
No.
For you.
Well, I mean, listen, it's fair because obviously at this point, the reason we're talking about those three that highly is because it's tough to find those obvious flaws, I guess. All right, so every organization's different, and I don't know this to be true, but I'd imagine with the Rangers' lack of success in the first round over the last decade or so, as much as they'd love to get the second best player in the draft when we look back or the best player, I think it might just be most important picking second to not have a flop.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, when a team is picking this high in the draft, and I don't know what, I'm sure every team has a different philosophy, and I'm sure the success of a given team in the draft might alter that philosophy. If you've hit on a lot of guys, maybe you don't feel the pressure, but how much does a team draft the safe pick? And I don't mean safe when you're picking second as the guy who's just going to be, he's fine, he'll make it to the majors. But like the kind of what we're talking about, they consider the safety of the pick versus maybe the guy who isn't as safe, but also might have a little bit higher ceiling.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that's a fascinating conversation to have. And I think the kind of risk versus, or just the risk profile that teams feel comfortable with varies highly depending on the team. Like I think a team like the Padres is very comfortable taking on players who have high risk profiles. But again, with those player types, you generally get a higher reward kind of tool set. I think the Rangers have previously been a team that is not hesitant at all to go for those high risk, high reward high school types. They used to be really heavy high school drafting team. The last 2 years in the first round, at least, they've gone for more of the college performer type. So perhaps that is a shift for them, going for maybe a safer demographic. And it also could just be those draft years, that's the player who fell to them and they thought it was the best talent on the board. I do think most teams will say that they're looking for the best talent that's available to them when they pick. Now, if it's just one player, you take that guy and you move on. But if you have a group of people, maybe you have a group of 4 or 5 players, and for the Rangers, maybe they have a group of 3 or 4 when they're on the board, when the draft comes, maybe you do say, hey, we really need to just make sure this one hits. And so to do the tiebreaker in that player tier, maybe you go for a demographic that has either historically been pretty safe or a college hitter who has a long track record of success, players that you do think have a lower risk profile than the other players in the same talent pool. And I think all teams would kind of handle that question differently. It'll be interesting to see. I think another guy that we haven't talked about here in this top 3 of players, but Adrian Del Castillo at Miami, I think has a chance to be one of the safer profiles overall in the entire class, because I feel like most teams and his hitting track record in the ACC will show he's just a very consistent hitter. And whether or not you think he's a catcher, you think he'll have to move off the position, or if you have questions of how much impact power he'll get to, I feel like a lot of people in the industry just generally feel like he'll be a big league hitter in some capacity. So those conversations are super fascinating. And I feel like hopefully we'll get a better idea for how those profiles are stacking up in the elite tier of the class as we move on. And if different players jump into this top 3 kind of tier we're talking about.
All right, last thing, and you guys talked about this on the most recent episode of the Future Projection podcast, and I thought it was a really interesting topic, but the data. 10 years ago, the amount of data for any of these guys was limited, but data has just become such a growing beast that there is all sorts of data available for college players, especially guys that come from, big programs. What about that compared to whatever data is available for Jordan Lawler? How does that, how do those 2 elements compare, and how does that impact the evaluation of a high school kid? Because obviously they could be going up against someone like me on the mound who's just throwing like 75 right down the middle versus, Kumar Rocker and Jack Leiter facing, future big league hitters. So how does data equalize things, and what data is available for some of these high school kids?
Yeah, I think that the data in the space, even since I started at Baseball America in 2017 and really started doing the draft kind of on my own in 2018, has come a long way. I feel like even for the high school players now, especially the guys who are going to these summer showcase uh, workouts and the showcases and the All America games and the big tournaments, a lot of these events and programs are having players, they're providing an opportunity for players to get their data out there. Teams have access to a lot of these high school player data. When teams will invite players in for workouts before the draft, they'll have access to all the TrackMan and the Hawkeye and everything they have set up in their stadium to collect that sort of on-field data. There are, I mean, bat sensors are at all of these workouts and in batting practices, so you can get an idea of quantifying bat speed for players and launch angle and the plane of the barrel, things like that. So it is everywhere now. I don't know that I would still think, I think you're right that the college guys, there's probably a greater access for data across the board. And you do make a good point about the competitive level. You can feel a little bit better about the competition they're playing. But I think this year specifically, the high school players might even have an edge because none of the college guys got a typical summer evaluation period where you had a Cape Cod League where all the best college players in the class were playing against each other, or a Team USA where you can see all of the elite players. I mean, if you just look back at the Team USA rosters over the last few years, you get to see basically a bulk of the first round of college players on the same field. So not getting that environment where you can see who really stands out in that sort of setting is going to hurt the college class. Whereas with the high school class, Jordan Lawler had a really good chance to play against the best high school players in this draft class. And I think those summer evaluation looks for the high school guys have become extremely important. And in some ways, especially for hitters, this summer is really where Jordan Lawler kind of established his stock. I don't think he'll move too much up or down this year based on what he's doing against local Texas talent, although that region is better than many places in the country. So that's my long-winded answer of hopefully that covered what you were trying to get at.
No, absolutely. And Carlos, appreciate it. Again, you can follow Carlos on Twitter at Carlos A. Collazo. You can read his work on Baseball America. And also, like I do, tune into the Future Projection podcast with Carlos and Ben Badler. It's really good stuff, especially for you Rangers fans out there who maybe don't have a ton of experience following the draft, don't really know much about these prospects. They do a great job of breaking that stuff down and updating stuff as the seasons for these guys progress. Carlos, hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you sometime before the draft again, but really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, I would love to come back on. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.